All right, welcome back. This is the fourth presentation of Chapter 2, the Founding and the Constitution. We've been talking about some of the different kind of key architectural elements of the Constitution, just what Articles 1 through 7, were designed to achieve. Talk briefly about basically the politics of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, who were the two principal groups that organized around the idea of this campaign to secure ratification. Again, if you remember in Article 7, it basically says that you need to have a supermajority. 9 of the 13 colonies had to ratify, and they had to, basically the people that signed the Constitution and wanted the Constitution to be adopted, recognized that just sending it to the state legislatures would have been a death sentence. And so they said, let's have elections for state conventions, and what those state conventions decide will determine whether the Constitution is ratified or not. So again, that set up a campaign process, and ultimately the people that favored ratification became known as the Federalists, and people that opposed it became known as the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists were predominantly the people living in the larger cities. They were the people that previously had been kind of favorable or at least neutral towards the Crown, and they were mostly the folks living in those areas where you need a certain amount of public order in order for people to do business. They're not people living out in farms predominantly. The Anti-Federalists are those folks. They're the folks living in the frontier. They're the people living in small towns that are primarily organized around agriculture. They have typically viewed government as an impediment rather than as a facilitator of what it is that they do. And so there were several key issues that divided them, but they can kind of be boiled down to the kinds of issues that continue to divide us today, which is some people think we need more government and some people think we need less. And so we'll talk more about the kind of the divisiveness, the sense in which the more government you have, the greater at least the potential for authoritarianism. So ratification was not a done deal. Again, it required an electoral process for state conventions. And so there was a considerable amount of debate, both in terms of the elections that were held and promises that were made and the platforms that were advanced. And then, there was a great deal of debate within those conventions as well. So the struggle over the ratification process played out very differently in the 13 colonies, so the 13 independent states. North Carolina actually, I think, rejected almost immediately, and then once the 9th state finally did ratify, they kind of hastily, went back and accepted it. So the for or against nature of the ratification process went a long way towards, kind of influencing the shape of American politics. Part of the reason why we have a two-party system is the sense in which, very frequently, the echoes of the past, the sense in which we tend to be kind of a for or against kind of society, whereas many other societies have much more complex deliberations when it comes to politics. Both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists fought bitterly over the wisdom of the new Constitution. The Federalist Papers were basically a series of pamphlets that were published in New York City newspapers or New York newspapers that were dedicated to the proposition that the Constitution should be ratified. The Anti-Federalists advanced 3 kind of basic arguments against the proposed Constitution. One, their fear was that in terms of representation, that the smaller states would not be adequately recognized, that the larger states, Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia, would basically dominate the smaller states. The second argument was that this would, federalism was basically just a mask, that eventually we were going to become a more and more unitary kind of, governmental system. And again, they were, third, they were also very much concerned about the government accruing excessive amounts of power. And again, you hear these echoes today. way. And again, the question is, as times have changed, have we needed more government? If your answer is yes, it's going to incline you in a particular direction politically. If your answer is no, then you're going to be inclined in a different direction. And one of the things I would point out is that sometimes, less government or the greater the gaps there are in terms of governmental authority, it doesn't mean that nature abhors a vacuum, and power flows into those empty spaces. And oftentimes it is not particularly power that is not respectful of other people's rights. So compromise contributed significantly to the success of the both ratification and the new Constitution. Ultimately, the required number of states ratified the Constitution, but the Federalists made a number of important concessions in an effort to mollify the Anti-Federalists. They recognized they were going to have to get some buy-in. So in addition to the compromises they made with the slave states, they also agreed to create a Bill of Rights, which initially, again, only applied to the federal government. And I've seen the argument made in several places where what actually happened with the Constitution was not really a democracy. Democracy wasn't really mentioned that much. Republicanism was. And it wasn't really a singular experiment. What happened was through the process of creating this compound republic, you allowed two separate experiments. One in sort of a capitalist republicanism that was emerging in the northeastern states, and then a more authoritarian slave-based governmental system that was emerging in the South. And so one of the things that happened, of course, we fought over the issue of slavery right up to the Civil War, and then you had the Civil War, and the perceived need to fundamentally reorient our Constitution, and that led to the proposal and ratification of what we call the Civil War amendments. And the 14th Amendment fundamentally changes the nature of the relationship between the federal government and the states, and between the federal government and citizens. It basically applies incorporates, if you will, the Bill of Rights to the states as well as to the federal government. So, again, it's important to recognize that the willingness of the Federalists to accommodate the legitimate concerns of the Anti-Federalists established the trust necessary for effective government. Not to say that the government was perfect. There were, and we continue to have lots and lots of problems with our government, but nevertheless, the reforms that were put in place created enough government, right? America side by side, what are the key differences between a parliamentary, presidential, and semi-presidential system? I mean, if you think about it in simple terms, and you guys can take a look at this slide in your spare time, it's in the text. A parliamentary system is basically, again, a system where the government emerges out of the legislature. Whichever party or coalition of party, achieves control over the government, achieves a majority, they form the government. The executive, the prime minister, if you will, emerges out of the legislature. Okay, a presidential system is much more oriented around the idea of separate institutions engaging in the process of governing. And semi-presidential systems like France and Russia have tended to be systems that are a little bit more unstable because an independently elected president also has exceptional kind of prerogative powers, the power to just, the power to issue edicts, if you will. And again, when you think about it in simple terms, parliamentary systems are more efficient, but they're also very prone to becoming, autocratic. Presidential systems are also more prone to devolving into what Francis Fukuyama described as vetocracies, which is kind of what we're dealing with right now. We can't govern because we can't achieve the compromises necessary, because the two sides, or the multiple sides, don't really trust one another. So who participates? Who gained the right to vote through amendments? Again, when you think about it, the 19th Amendment is one of the most significant, constitutional revisions because it literally extends the vote to half of the American voting public. The 15th Amendment likewise is very significant because it gives to black men the power to vote. And then, of course, the 26th Amendment, it lowers the threshold of voting from whatever it was at the various state levels to 18 years old. So again, a question that's on this slide: should we amend the Constitution to guarantee a right to vote to all Americans, subject to reasonable qualifications, like an age? I think it's legitimate to say that you should be at least 18 years old. Some people have said we should have an educational requirement, but again, that would politicize education in very dangerous ways. So what do you think? Americans continue to revere the Constitution, even as they express mounting dissatisfaction with sort of government per se. The founders had a tendency of placing a priority on individual liberty. They were fearful of excessive democracy that would degenerate into a tyranny of the majority. And the framers were clearly convinced that the idea of achieving some sort of governing balance would create a sustainable version of republicanism that would restrain the action of passionate majorities. And, if change is going to happen, it would happen, slowly. So what do you think? By placing a premium on liberty, the framers ensured a continuous fight by women and minority groups to be treated with equal dignity. Throughout American history, government has guaranteed maximum liberty for some, often at the cost of others. So what do you think about the values of liberty, equality, and justice? Which is more important to you? Advocates for a particular policy position often invoke cherished values. What kinds of arguments could both supporters and opponents of removing statues of the nation's founders from public places make in using, in invoking those three values? Are there policy areas where you're frustrated by the slow pace of change? Are there areas where you're kind of happy at the slow rate of change? When you think about the Dobbs decision, were you sort of shocked at how fast that happened? What are your views on the pros and cons of our constitutional structure? Is there one amendment that you would propose? What is it? All right, that's it for this, for this chapter. So when we return, we're moving on to the next chapter, which takes a closer look at the very important concept of federalism. I'll see you next time.